how to untangle relationship problems. That's what we're talking about here today in this episode of 4 Habits to Transform Your Marriage. You've probably been there before where you have a ball of yarn or a rope that gets all tangled up, and the harder you pull, the worse the problem becomes. And so what you really need is a different approach to untangling that problem. And oftentimes, really what you need is a different approach to untangling your relationship problems. I'm Carrie Decker for this session of 4 Habits to Transform Your Marriage. We'll be right back. A while back, I had an opportunity to sit down with Dr. Walter Lynn to talk with him about untangling relationship problems. And he began by talking about the problem of perspective. Let's pick up from there and see what he has to say.
It's always interesting to kind of hear different perspectives.
Sure.
And one thing we know, of course, we all know this, we all have different perspectives about everything.
Yeah.
And we also know, of course, that there's no such thing as objective memory. We all have our own subjective experiences. Sure. But that tends to go out the window when we're having an argument or a conflict.
Yeah.
We lose that ability to believe that someone else has a different point of view.
We were talking before about this notion how that we wouldn't have so much conflict if everybody saw reality the same way that I do,
yes,
or the issue the same way that I do. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, okay, in its simplest form, what we really believe is that we would get along just fine if you would treat me the way I would treat me if I lived inside of your body.
Yeah.
So, I have a certain amount of expectations on how I should be spoken to, how I should be treated. And when those expectations aren't met, many times I'm kind of caught off guard by that. And I'm surprised that you would treat me the way that you did.
Yeah.
And after 42 years of marriage now, I still tend to be surprised that she doesn't say it just right all the time, or the way that I want her to,
yeah,
and vice versa. So I think where we really get into trouble is when we're caught off guard. And I don't know anyone who's really good at getting caught off guard.
Yeah, really.
So I don't care how many books we've read or how many we've written, we tend to react when we have an expectation that's just not met.
My wife and I hit a little speed bump. Now, it wasn't a major pothole, but it was a little speed bump, and I had done some things that offended her, and then I could tell that things were a little chilly in the room, and so she came to me and she says, "I'm really angry with you right now." And so I said, "Well, tell me a little bit about that." And we had the conversation. I could see that some of the things that I'd done, that it had I'd gone sideways with her, so I apologized for my part on that. And then after that, is that I could see that the temperature was going down a little bit in the conversation. So I said, "Well, can I share with you a different perspective?" And then I began talking with her about my point of view and my expectations in the relationship. And so we were able to resolve that at that time. But help me to understand why couples never seem to get to that place. It just becomes an unmet expectation, and then it just goes from there and deteriorates from there.
Right, and so you were really kind of answering a very important part of the question by suggesting that she was willing to listen to your perspective.
Yeah, okay.
So that's one of the answers to the question. Why we never tend to quite resolve issues is because it's really hard for us to listen to the other person's point of view when we've already come to our own conclusion that they're wrong.
Yeah.
And we want to teach them why they're wrong,
Yeah.
instead of actually respect their point of view.
Yeah.
So in conflict resolution, we need to teach people that we're not really seeking agreement.
Okay.
We're seeking understanding, which is very different. And if we can understand the other person's point of view, then hopefully we can take some steps toward respect. Mutual respect then makes us closer.
Yeah.
If I feel like you've actually listened to my point of view and cared enough about it to actually convince me that you have listened to it, then it's easier for me to kind of sit back and listen to yours.
Yeah.
And a mutual respect is developed there.
Yeah.
But the other thing that happens, though, of course, is if I really feel that you intentionally did something to hurt me,
Okay.
then we're no longer in civil court, as it were. We're kind of in criminal court now, and
Gotcha.
and I have evidence against you that you did it on purpose.
Yeah.
And I've already convicted you in my mind, so it's going to be hard for me to back off and believe that you had any good intentions when I've already kind of made up my mind that you didn't.
In relationships, there are times when we're in civil court and we have to kind of negotiate through those difficulties. But there are times when the conflict has gone beyond that to criminal court. Let's say in the case of an affair, or the case of lying about finances and spending.
Yes.
Or some of these other major issues that couples get embroiled in. Are the principles for resolving conflict the same when you're dealing with these minor infractions like the one that my wife and I had the other day versus major issues in the home?
Yes, they are in its simplest or ideal form. They're the same, and yet in an ideal world, if I've hurt you, even if it was intentional,
yeah,
I can get to the point more quickly of kind of asking myself, did I do that? Was it wrong? And admit it to myself, and then I admit it to you. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry that I did that, and then of course to take it a step deeper. Would you forgive me for what I did? Yeah. And in the ideal world, then you say, okay, he's admitted that he did something that hurt me, and he's asked for forgiveness. Now I can accept his apology, give him forgiveness, and that brings us closer together. And yet, by the time that usually happens, and in the case you just mentioned, if I feel like I've been lied to,
yeah,
and there's been deception, that really puts it in a whole different category. It's a whole different place when I feel like I've been lied to, because now I'm not really sure how to trust if you're telling me the truth this time.
Yeah, I got you.
And then it becomes an even deeper problem that, so now my real concern isn't that you would do something that would hurt me. That's a concern, of course, but it's not my primary concern, or that you actually lied to me about it. It's that I've got to protect myself from believing you again if I'm going to find out that I've been stupid for doing so.
Yeah, yeah.
So I actually end up start protecting myself from being stupid
Sure.
more than protecting myself from what you did that hurt me.
How can you prevent this gridlock from occurring if you are the offended person?
Yeah. Okay, so back to the illustration. If I've convinced myself that the worst thing that could ever happen would be for me to be stupid enough to trust someone who's going to prove that they're not trustworthy,
Yeah.
then I will operate according to that assumption, and I'll start collecting evidence that it was, in fact, the worst thing that ever happened.
Gotcha.
When in reality, the worst thing that could ever happen is that I'd end up spending the rest of my life trying to keep that from ever happening again.
Yeah.
Because we are certainly going to have relationships in the future where we're going to be hurt again. Or someone's going to make a mistake or
Sure.
even intentionally hurt us. We just don't want to be lied to again, or we don't want to find out that we were giving our trust back to someone or our heart back to someone who's going to misuse it.
So that would be the case where I'm the offended person. And so it sounds to me like what you're saying is that the way to break the gridlock in that situation is to dare to risk again. Now, I realize that some of that has to be measured, because if you're in an abusive relationship where the person's beating you or whatever, and then they apologize and promise and shed the tears and so on and so forth, is that it seems to me that it would be legitimate to say, well, that I want to be able to trust you again, I just can't believe you right now.
Well, and I think that's a very honest statement.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty healthy statement. I want to, and I just am not able to yet.
Yeah.
And I really like to encourage, especially when I'm working with couples that are in crisis, the yet is a very important point of the conversation. We're just not there yet. We're in a process of restoring trust. And I really do want to trust you, but right now, in all honesty, I don't want to because I'm not ready to yet.
Yeah, yeah.
And the offender, the one who did the offending, of course, lives on the inside of what I did that hurt you. So I really do feel like if you understood how repentant I was or how sorry I was, that you would forgive me and we could move on.
Yeah.
It's just hard for me to imagine why you can't trust me yet.
Yeah.
And the point is, well, I really can't yet. We're in a process. It takes time for trust to be restored.
What are some of the right things to do when you're an offender?
And I'm asked this question all the time.
Yeah.
I'll have guys especially who will come in and they'll say, Walter, what can I do? And I'll just be honest with them. I say, it looks like right now there's nothing you can do.
Yeah, okay.
And so, I'll say, memorize this phrase. So sometimes there's nothing that you can do to make things better, but there's hundreds of things you can do to make them worse. So instead of let's try to figure out the list of things to do, let's make a list of things to not do.
Yeah.
Because the things that you've done in the past did not help. So let's don't do those anymore. I really believe I'm doing the things that are right and I'm not doing the things that are wrong. So why is my spouse or this hurting partner of mine or my business partner or an employee, for example, why aren't they getting better? Well, again, it takes time. It takes a process.
Sure.
But there are some things to say and not say.
Okay.
I'll have, again, if we're talking about a husband will come in and he'll say to his wife, I'll do whatever it takes. And I'll say, oh, please don't say that, because that's just not going to go anywhere helpful. Because, she's sitting here hearing you say that, and she just wants to scream. Because if you really wanted to do whatever it took, then we wouldn't be in this position.
Gotcha.
So say instead, I'm going to do what I can do today to try to re-earn your trust and try to be the man that I really was created to be. And it's going to be hard work. I'm not going to make you promises other than I'm just going to be today the man that you need for me to be, the one I want to be. And I hope that you can accept that as true.
Yeah.
And then those days add up, and after months of that, then hopefully a wife who's been very hurt wakes up one morning and it's like, wow, I'm at that place where I actually can now. I didn't even know it was going to happen this morning, but this morning is the day when I finally can say, yes, I trust you again.
Well, let's talk about that. I want to hear maybe like the top 3 to 5 items that you would put on that list of things not to do when you're an offender. So those things would keep the polarization going.
So, there's a long list of things that we can do to make things worse.
Okay.
And some of those come under the obvious categories of substance abuse or alcohol or relationships outside of the marriage, as an example. Just things that we do to try to relieve ourselves of the stress that we're going through. Those things make it worse.
Yeah.
But a thing to not do that many times happens, and we talk about this in our book, we call it solving for X. It's that solving for X is that I need to look at myself and be willing to understand what it is that I brought to the problem.
Yeah.
Instead of solving for your problem, I'm solving for mine. So the thing to not do, especially early in the rebuilding of trust, is to be trying to convince you that it wasn't all my fault, that it was just part of your fault as well.
Yeah. I see where that's really hard is for the offended person to solve for X, because they're seeing all of the problem, or at least the lion's share of the problem, on the other side of the relationship. And they're oftentimes unwilling to examine what they brought into the relationship that either set it up for some sort of breakdown, or at least when the breakdown was occurring, maybe turned a blind eye to it or whatever else. So let's talk a little bit about the quote-unquote innocent party and how that they need to solve for X too.
Right. Well, and of course that can be very difficult to do. If it depends on how much woundedness or how much history I have with being wounded or being victimized, or even if I put it in the category of being victimized. And sometimes that person has compounded woundedness, which makes it even more difficult for them to look at themselves. But I'll tell you, when I work with the couples that are in crisis, the sooner that the offended person can start solving for X, start looking at themselves and being willing to say, this is really the part that I see that I brought that created the problem. It's not just that you did this to me, is that we had problems before you did it to me. Then all of a sudden, now we're really on the right track. It's very difficult to get someone there if they are so wounded, or if they, on the other hand, they just decide, I like the power that I now have because I'm the one that's...
I'm the victim.
I'm the victim, right? And there's just a lot of power that comes with that. So now every problem that we've ever had in our relationship is now all of your fault. Or even if there were other things, what you've done to me now trumps everything else. We don't get to look at anything that I brought. And that's part of a process. That can be very difficult, of course.
As a pastor, I've seen couples live their whole, or at least the bulk of their married life with that dynamic. I'm sure they started off, like all young couples do, full of expectation and hope that this is going to be wonderful. And then all of a sudden, some sort of pain is introduced into the relationship, some sort of disappointment. And from there on out, that victimization, the power of victimization becomes the centerpiece of the relationship.
Yes, and the word disappointment is a door that we can open that goes into just about every one of those conversations. When we've been greatly disappointed, and that can lead to great amount of grief, of course, as well.
Sure. And
sometimes, we misunderstand the difference between depression, clinical depression, and deep grief. And it's understandable why we do, because in a certain place they feel exactly the same way.
They don't come with labels inside of us.
But the good difference between grief and depression is that hopefully grief is something that leads toward healing. Even though it feels just as miserable, it actually goes somewhere healthy if we allow it to run its course. Then, of course, we can actually help it by doing some of the things we've been talking about. To talk about my grief, to talk about my disappointment. And in the illustration that you gave earlier, a wife needs to hear from her husband, let me share my perspective. And it's also good for her to say, you know what, I'm angry at you right now. I kind of like that. It'd be nice.
I don't want to hear your perspective.
It'd be nice if we lived in a world where people could say, you know what, I'm angry. And here's why. And the person who's hearing that can say, all right, tell me why you're angry. Without us just having to put walls up and hide behind them.
I'm going to talk about this notion of disappointment. We've identified it as having three layers. The layer of the issue, where there is the triggering event, either something you said or did, or something you didn't say or didn't do. And so there's the issue. Underneath that is the presenting emotion. There's the emotions with the presenting emotion and underlying emotion. Typically, the presenting emotion would be like anger or hurt type of thing. And then below that are needs and vulnerabilities. It seems to me that couples or individuals in relationship, people in relationship, that they get stuck in that place of just rehashing the issue or reacting to the presenting emotion. And so how would you coach somebody to get past the issue, past the presenting emotion, and get down to the place where we can talk about those underlying emotions, the feeling of being neglected or devalued or disrespected, and the needs and vulnerabilities. So how would you coach somebody past just living on the surface to going deeper in that conversation?
All right, so in order to be coaching someone to do that, we really have to assess, first of all, their willingness to do it.
Gotcha.
And so some people are just not ready, and again, ready yet is the real issue. We're in a process, so it's nice to be there with someone who says, yes, I'm willing, but I'm reluctant.
Yeah.
Then we get to respect their reluctance. I see why you're reluctant. Tell me some more about that.
Okay.
And it's because I've been so disappointed. I don't want to be disappointed again. But again, I don't want to be stupid enough to allow myself to be hurt again. And we validate that.
Yeah, okay.
You know, we try to be used as someone who can kind of reopen that kind of closed spirit.
Yeah.
And sometimes that happens individually before we can actually help them in a relationship with someone else. Validate them, try to help them figure out how to say things differently, how to be able to verbalize their disappointments that are so deep.
Yeah.
And where they're really vulnerable, let's get it out, let's talk about it, instead of just live it out and protect it. It's like, you know, I can talk with you about this, but I'm not going to talk with my husband about this because I just don't trust him.
Yeah.
All right, well, that doesn't mean that you can't. You just can't right now. You just can't yet because you're not really confident in your own ability to say it in a way that you make sure that he hears you. So sometimes coaching actually helps someone learn how to say things differently, and we give them a high five.
It seems to me that oftentimes what happens in these types of relationships is that when an issue comes up, is that the offended person reacts to the issue. Then the other party in the relationship reacts to the offended person.
Yes.
And then it just goes back and forth from there. How do you break out of that?
Right. Okay. So you're really talking about reactivity versus response, and so we need to learn how to respond instead of just react. And the illustration of the woman who was responding with, you know, I didn't really do anything wrong, instead of just reacting in defensiveness. That was a response that she'd worked on. It wasn't just reactivity. And in order to learn a new response, she had to be willing to admit that it's not helping for me to just react. I understand why I just react. And I have a whole list of ways to react that are not helpful. So I need to learn some ways to respond that are helpful.
Yeah.
Willing, of course, at the same time to understand that if I give a healthy response, I really can't control what the other person does with it.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not really my business in a sense. It's my business to try to change the way that I communicate, how I respond in ways that are healthy. And of course, Response 101 talks about I statements instead of you statements. I didn't do anything wrong. Instead of, you're bullying me again.
Gotcha.
That's a you statement. So I didn't do anything wrong here was a practiced response. And it was a very healthy one.
So a lot of times I believe that individuals just don't have those tools in their toolkit. So we learn, it seems like we learn all of the wrong ways of dealing with conflict when we are growing up or whatever else.
Yeah.
And then we bring those forward into our relationships, which, by the way, gets back to this solving for X thing. We just kind of always advance our defective ways of resolving conflict.
Yes. Yeah.
But what you were talking about here is this woman was able to step out of that and bring something positive for the resolution of the conflict.
Yeah, she didn't need to say to her employer, you're a bully.
Yeah.
She just needed to decide, I'm not going to allow him to bully me anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
And from that point on, let's just believe that relationship is going to change.
Yeah.
Now she, as you're suggesting, she had to unlearn some reactivity that she'd been perfecting probably by the time she was 3 years old. And any of us have ever been around 3-year-olds, we know that they're experts. And then we just perfect our techniques from that point on.
Yeah.
We know how to blame someone else for our problems. We know how to deal with shame. In our own lives, I'm so shameful. So we've got to unlearn how to do those things because they simply don't help.
I love Dr. Lynn's insights about untangling relationship problems, and I trust that you found something in this show that will help you to move forward in your relationships. Our 4 Habits to Transform Your Relationships online summit is just full of great content, and we trust in the upcoming shows you'll find something that will benefit you. And so I'm Carrie Decker. I'll see you next time.